First, I want to thank Sebastian for encouraging me to be here finally, and it's a real opportunity to have a discussion with people, especially with Lars Lee, who we tried to get together about 4 years ago to have a discussion. It didn't work out, but I think we'll be able to have one today. And I think what Constantine raises is very interesting because it actually complements some of the things I'll be getting into. The question of the book I'm working on now is the following. Can the electoral and parliamentary arenas be used toward revolutionary ends? And a related question, are European social democratic reformism or anarchist abstentionism the only alternatives? These are the questions, the political questions I take up, and I make 4 arguments in the book. And the first is that no one I'm aware of, and people may have other opinions about this, but no one I think has given as much attention to this question in the history of revolutionary movements as did Lenin. No one spent as much time on this question as did Lenin. That's the first argument I make. The second argument I make is that Lenin's analysis was deeply rooted and fundamentally rooted in the ideas of Marx and Engels. That's the second claim. The third claim I make is that the split that took place in the Second International was long in place before the guns of August of 1914. And the differences began to emerge, especially around differences on the question of electoral and parliamentary strategy. And the fourth claim I make is perhaps the most important, the so what claim. That is, I argue that the Bolsheviks were hegemonic in October of 1917, largely because of the experiences that they had been through with Lenin in the electoral and the parliamentary arena. That's the fourth claim. And what I want to do now is just to briefly describe what the book will look like. It's almost completed, and just to give you a sense of what I'm doing. And I'll be reporting on really just on that fourth. I'll get into some detail on the fourth argument. The first chapter, substantive chapter of the book, is about Marx and Engels' electoral strategy. If my second claim is correct, that Lenin was deeply rooted in Marx and Engels, I have to lay out what Marx and Engels, their electoral strategy was. And that's what I do in the first chapter, looking at how that strategy came out of the 1848, 1849 revolutions. And a key document in that is the March 1850 address to the central authority of the Communist League. That's a crucial document. It's about 11-page document, but most important. And that document was a summary, was a balance sheet on what had happened in 1848, 1849, especially around the question of electoral strategy. That document is also important because we are told by David Ryazanov, the Bolshevik archivist, that Lenin had committed the document to memory and loved reciting that document. And if you read it and you know about the strategy Lenin employed in 1917, I think you'll see how indeed that document, I think, played a key role in his strategy in 1917. So that's what I do in the first chapter. I go through the 1840, 1849 experiences, and then look at the founding of the First International. The next most important document is the inaugural address and the provisional rules. And the central theme there is independent working class political action. And that theme of independent working class political action is the central theme of the 11-page 1850 March address When you read the 11-page 1850 address, I count the word independent at least 10 to 12 times in that document. Almost every page, the emphasis is on the independence of the working class, independent working class political action. The experience of the First International is important because leading up to the 1872 Hague Conference is the London Hague Congress is the London Conference a year earlier in 1871, where the famous resolution number 9 is voted upon, and that's really the resolution that really kicks off the beginning of what become European labor parties and social democratic parties. That's the resolution that gives authority, based in part on what's happening in Germany, but it really is the document, the key document. The debates with the anarchists are extremely important at that conference in 1870. The abstentionist position. The document in many ways is a challenge to the anarchist line of abstention in a political arena. And the experience of the First International also taught the Marx and Engels about the problem of opportunism and reformism. In the British experience was especially the trade union movement in Britain in the electoral arena. The liberal coalition was most instructive for Marx and Engels. Then, of course, the lessons of Paris, the Paris Commune, figures significantly in their perspective. And, of course, the most important lesson is the only addendum that they ever made to the manifesto, and that what Paris had proven is that the working class cannot lay hold to the bourgeois state to carry out socialist transformation. It cannot make use of the bourgeois state. A new state will have to be utilized, and the experiences of the Commune, putting together a new kind of state, that was the essential lesson that they drew. Other important documents are what happens in the German party, the increasing reformism and opportunism within the German party. And so the 1879 circular, the critique of Bernstein and others in 1879 is crucial, a part of the record. They begin to see this problem. They think that they're able to hold it off, but not really. Once Engels is in his grave, then Bernstein feels confident that he can go forward with his reformist perspective. Engels's Origin of the State is an extremely important document, which Lenin will often emphasize. And it was written on the eve of the 1848 Reichstag elections. And Lenin recognizes, Engels has to deal with the censors, Bismarck's censors, so he has to be careful about how he actually words it. But the key line which Lenin will never forget is universal suffrage is the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything more in the present day state, but that is sufficient. One day the thermometer of universal suffrage registers the boiling point among the workers. Both they and the capitalists will know where they stand. By the way, I think I differ with Constantine on the question of the Engels-Marx question. I think you have to include Engels in that discussion, and I know of only one political difference that they actually had, and that was around the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. But I think when it comes to their politics, I see no. And I think especially on this question, especially the question that you raised, I think Engels has to be a part of the question. This comment from the Origin about universal suffrage, Engels could be a little bit more explicit in a letter a few years later to Paul Lafargue about the electoral process. And this was following some elections that had just taken place and some advances that had been made in the electoral process by the French party. Engles says, "Do you realize now what a splendid weapon you in France have had in your hands for 40 years in universal suffrage? If only people knew how to use it. It's slower and more boring than the call to revolution, but it's 10 times more sure. And what is even better, it indicates with the most perfect accuracy the day when a call to armed revolution has to be made. It's even 10 to 1 that universal suffrage, intelligently used by the workers, will drive the rulers to overthrow legality. That is, to put us in the most favorable position to make the revolution." So that's what I lay out. This is a sketch of some of the things I raised in the first chapter, looking at Marx and Engels. In the second chapter, I look at Lenin's political ideas from the very beginning up until 1905. Why up until 1905 is because it's in 1905 when Lenin and the Bolsheviks will get a chance to participate in the electoral arena. And the real meat of the book is around the four Dumas, the four parliamentary arenas that were granted by the regime, and the first of the four begins in 1906. And Lenin's most explicit statements, everything he would do that's of interest to this book certainly, but his begins in 1905. So what I do in the second chapter is to look at, well, what were Lenin's politics before 1905? Did he say anything about the electoral arena? What did he think about parliamentary democracy and so on? And I won't be able to get into the details here, but the record, I think, is quite clear that for Lenin, in the tradition of Marx and Engels, parliamentary democracy or the bourgeois democracy, political democracy was necessary for the socialist revolution. That was, in fact, he begins to, in the What Are the Friends? I think it's the first statement, I think in 1894, where he's calling for, we should call ourselves social democrats, and he explains why, because of the importance of the bourgeois democratic revolution, political democracy, why we communists should call ourselves social democrats. All right. In chapter 3, I take up the experience of the 1905 revolution and the First Duma. And the 1905 revolution is when the Tsar Nicholas is under pressure to trying to make some kinds of concessions and to head off the mass struggle. And what he does there is to propose, in order to get the masses out of the streets, to make concessions. Okay, we'll grant a parliamentary regime. And there's a big debate amongst all progressive democratic forces whether or not do you participate in this. Is very clear that that's what it's about an effort to head off the mass movement in the street, to try to bring that energy into the electoral arena in a real fake parliamentary regime. So there's a big debate, and most of the left, including the liberals, even the liberals and the cadets, decide to boycott this first effort at a parliament. And it's called Buyigin Duma, and indeed it's boycotted, and the regime is forced to come up with a new set of proposals for a Duma. And that's, by this time, the revolution, it's not clear, it's only in hindsight, the revolution is in a decline, and the first set of elections are held for that Duma, the so-called Witte Duma. And there's a big debate, once again, amongst progressive forces whether or not to participate in those elections or not. And the Bolsheviks decide not to participate in the elections. And a close reading of the text makes it very clear that Lenin wanted to participate in those elections. And he bent to the will of the majority, especially the comrades who were working on the inside, who had not been in exile like he, felt that they had a better feel for what was going on the inside, and decided to go along with and defended it. But it's clear when you read the text, he's uncomfortable. And what makes it so clear is later in 1921 in left-wing communism, he will make it very clear it was a mistake to boycott those elections. The big problem and the big difficulty to face was whether or not was the revolution still in the ascent or had it begun to decline. If it was still in the ascent, you boycott. If it was in the decline, the revolutionary movement was in the decline, then you needed to participate in the elections, understanding that if the regime wants the elections in order to divert the energy from the streets. So that's one of the first big debates that they face. And the Mensheviks decide to participate. And by this time, both the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks have reunited at a conference that took place in the Stockholm Congress, the Fourth Congress, the so-called Unity Congress that took place. And you sense that Lenin is glad there's a Unity Conference because he knows the Bolsheviks want to participate, and he wants to participate. And he actually breaks discipline with his faction in voting to participate in those elections.
He knows the Mensheviks want to participate.
I mean, the Mensheviks wanted to participate in those elections. So the elections take place while they're debating this, and so they really get in late on the elections. The elections are taking place while they're having this debate, and the outcome of the elections is that they are able to elect about 18 people, 18 Russian Social Democratic Labor Party deputies, and all of them are Mensheviks. That doesn't deter Lenin at all. He immediately goes into campaign mode, and also in working with these individuals and helping them to figure out, well, what do you do now once you get elected? What are the kind of policies? What are the things you're going to do? So that's what the First Duma is about. And perhaps the most revelatory thing for me in going through this was how much Lenin employed these Dumas as a way to forge the worker-peasant alliance. If there's any theme that runs through the four Dumas and what he's trying to get the deputies, the social democratic deputies, to do, how to form an alliance with the peasant deputies. And I argue it's the concrete manifestation, attempt to forge what his basic argument. Remember, in June of 1905, his two tactics, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. This is his way to try to bring that into existence in all of these Dumas, and it begins in the First Duma. And in the second, that Duma is summarily dismissed by Nicholas in 1906. It only is around for about three months in June of 1906. And the dominant party in it is the cadets, the liberal cadets. And much of what Lenin is doing, it begins in that Duma, is trying to bring clarity. Who are the cadets? It's the critique of liberalism. It's the most intense aspects of Lenin's politics, trying to break the peasant alliance with the liberals, and trying to get the fraction, and that's what it's called, the fraction, in the Duma, to how do you reach out to the peasants? How do you bring them on board? How do you split the peasants off from the liberals? And that Duma is ended, and Lenin recognizes it's an important teaching moment about the liberals in the parliamentary arena. The liberals invest all of their energy in thinking that indeed the parliamentary arena is the center of politics. And there's a term that Lenin loves to use, and he gets it from Engles from the 1848-1849 revolution, called parliamentary cretinism. Mm-hmm. That is, those who believe that the parliament is the end-all and the be-of-all of politics. And Lenin is constantly hammering on this question and accusing this is what the cadets are about. And he goes after the Mensheviks, so the Mensheviks keep bending. They keep bending to the cadets, because the Mensheviks are operating with the line of a simplistic reading of the manifesto about the need to unite with the bourgeoisie in order to get rid of the feudal regime. And Lenin is arguing that that's a very simplistic reading of the manifesto. But that's what the so that's the into the First Duma. In the Second Duma, I'll just briefly, the elections, in the Second Duma, Lenin is very clear. That will take place, the elections will take place in later in 1906, and Lenin decides that the Bolsheviks have to be a part of this. So rather than concede as he did before to the majority who wanted to boycott, he immediately issues, after the dissolution of the First Duma, an argument against boycott, why we have to participate in the elections. And he's in a distinct minority on this. And he has to wage a fight, an internal fight and debate within the Bolsheviks on the need to participate in the elections. And he's successful, he convinces the majority. But there's a grouping of them who really are dissidents, especially in Moscow, who really don't, Bogdanov and others, who really did not want to participate in the elections. But they do. And so the combination of both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks are able to elect 65 deputies to the second Duma, and that allows the Bolsheviks to be much more effective, at least Lenin, in trying to put together this worker peasant alliance. But it's a Duma that Lenin sees from the very beginning. There's a fundamental contradiction between the composition of that Duma and the reality of the regime. Something has to give. Something has to give. And indeed that happens when the regime decides to disperse that Duma in July of 1907. One of the key issues that arises, especially with these elections in which the Bolsheviks will now participate in and actively and are able to put together a platform ahead of time, is the famous lesser of evil problem. The lesser of two evil problem. This is what Lenin will address many an hour to dealing with. The argument of the Mensheviks is that we have to, as Mensheviks, we have to support the liberals. If we don't support the liberals, we'll allow the Black Hundreds to get in. Independent working class political action makes it easier for the most right-wing forces to get into office. So Lenin has to wage an argument, and he part of his argument is looking at the election returns from the First Duma and making a case about where would the Black Hundreds likely to get votes and so on. Would we really be splitting the vote if we ran our own candidates and so on? So he devotes numerous hours to that and is able to win over certainly most of the Bolsheviks, not the Mensheviks, to the perspective that running candidates will not make it possible for the most right-wing elements to get into the Duma. Again, that was the contradiction that he had seen at the beginning was indeed played out, and indeed the second Duma was dismissed by after 3 or 4 months by Nicholas. New elections are scheduled, and Nicholas, in order to make sure that this will be a Duma to his liking, the electoral rules are changed. They're not the most democratic electoral rules to begin with, but they will be severely reshaped by Nicholas to ensure the kind of Duma that he wants. And that's the third Duma, and that's the Duma that will be in the longest from 1907 until 1912, and that's the Duma in which the Bolsheviks and Lenin will get their greatest experience in how to operate within the parliamentary arena. Yes. Let me just end by saying that the Fourth Duma experience from 1912 until 1914 is perhaps the most consequential for the Bolsheviks. And it leads to the most consequential work, and that's the anti-war work, when the First World War breaks out in August of 1914. It provides what Lenin calls a model for doing parliamentary work, and you really see how they built upon the experiences of the previous Dumas. All right, fast forward to 1917, And in 1917, and I'll just conclude on this, and my argument, I can only sketch it out, is what I try to do is to sketch the dots that someone like Trotsky had sketched out, namely that it was the experience in the electoral arena that explains why the Bolsheviks were able to take power in October. And key to 1917 is Lenin's usage of the elections to both the Soviets, but also the elections to the local Dumas. And for Lenin, that becomes the measure, because that becomes the big issue as October gets close. Do we have support? Do we have majority support to be able to carry out an armed struggle? And for Lenin, it's the elections are crucial. The elections as a way of measuring, In other words, what I argue is that Lenin harkens back to Engles' advice that is using the elections as a measure, the temperature. And you see this in some of the memoirs of some of the activists later. Indeed, they keep talking about the temperature. We're using the elections to measure the temperature. In this, I argue, and I'll have to end here, is that I think goes a long way in explaining, indeed, why the Bolsheviks were able to do what they did, and why at the end, why, especially in St. Petersburg, why there is relatively little violence in St. Petersburg. Not necessarily Moscow, there's more, but in St. Petersburg, why there's relatively little violence. And the little violence, I think, is exactly because the Bolsheviks had already calculated the mass support. By October 25th, the Kerensky government forces really lacked support. So there was no resistance. And I should just end on this, and that is that throughout all of these four Dumas, one of the things the Bolsheviks emphasized was doing work inside the military. Doing work inside the military. There's the claim that people in uniform are simply workers and peasants in uniform. And the Bolsheviks had dozens and dozens of newspapers inside the military. So by the time, again, you get to October 25th, 1917, there's very little resistance in what is a relatively nonviolent affair, certainly in St. Petersburg. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you very much.